Hey everyone, Liam here. Welcome to this week's video. We're going to be painting this Blood Angel you can see on screen, as always with no airbrush. If you've got any questions, any feedback, feel free to leave them in the comments below. And if this video is helpful, please hit that like button. Feel free to subscribe. If you do want to support the channel to keep more of this free content going, feel free to check out my Patreon for additional, more in-depth video tutorials, as well as options for one-to-one tuition if you do want help improving your painting. I am also currently available for commissions, so check out the links in the description and feel free to get in touch. Here we go. So first thing that we're going to do is start off with a base coat of black. This can be any black. This particular one is Vallejo game color Negro black, so whatever works. The reason why we go with a black is because it means that the red that we put over the top of it has a really dark tone to it. So I've then used scale 75 deep red, and I'm going over the whole of the armor. The reason for this is because I don't actually want black as a shadow color for this, because the Blood Angels are because they've got such a vibrant red, a saturated red. Black will push them more towards like a flesh tearer's tone. So we're going to cover the whole of the armor color with this scale 75 deep red. Now in this case it has taken me 2 coats, but it depends on how much you thin your paint. The idea here is you thin your paint enough so you get as opaque a coverage as possible, but it's still thin enough so you're not obscuring any details. So it depends on the brand of paint that you're using, but if you just use a dark red, you'll be absolutely fine. Any dark red will do, you'll get a nice result. So after we've base coated this model with this scale 75 deep red, we need to move on to a more Blood Angel style red. Now, there are lots of nice ones that you can use from GW, from scale 75. In my case, I've used P3 Khador Red base with a drop of scale 75 inktensity red. So the reason why I'm using the inks as well as the P3 Khador Red is the ink adds a huge amount of vibrancy and saturation to the color. So it's going to give us a really, really nice Blood Angels red. You're going to see it on the model in a second. Now, the idea with this is similar to the other Space Marine videos that I've done. We're going to sketch out the areas that I want as the main red color. So it's worth noting the scale 75 deep red that we've just placed all over the model, that's going to be our shadow color for this model. And the Blood Angels red, so the Khador red with the scale 75 intensity ink, red ink is going to be our mid-tone color. This is going to be the color that covers the majority of the model. So I'm leaving the scale 75 deep red into any areas that I want darker, and then I'm covering everything else with this red. So this is the reason why this is so important to have it everywhere, is because this particular color is what's going to give the model the correct tone. So it's going to make it look like a Blood Angel effectively. So you can see my paint is thinned down to probably 1 part water to 1 part paint. The reality is, in this case, the ink adds a certain amount of fluidity to the paint anyway, so I don't need to thin it as much. And also, because we're using ink, it means that the paint is actually quite opaque. So we've got a fairly fluid paint, so we haven't got to worry about too much. We haven't got to worry about obscuring details too much, and we've got a very opaque paint, which means we can easily do this in 1 coat. And you can see I'm being quite messy. I'm not too worried about the transitions at the moment. Now, this is where things become interesting. Red is an incredibly difficult color to paint, because if you highlight red with white, it goes pink. If you highlight it with yellow or orange, it obviously goes orange. So the way we're going to work around that is I'm going to add white to that red ink P3 mix, but I'm also adding a certain amount of like a mustard color. So in this case, this is Vallejo model color Japanese uniform. I'm using the Vallejo model color paint because I'm interested in speed at this point, and the Vallejo model color has very good coverage. It's very opaque, and what happens is, by adding that yellow, because it's effectively like a brownie yellow, by adding that we get more of a salmon tone, so not quite pink. Now, the other reason why we're doing this is basically what we need to do is we want a bright color to put red back over. Remember, any color that we paint the color underneath influences the tone that that color comes out at. So by putting a brighter color over the red we've already painted, when we go back and paint that E3 scale 75 ink mix over the top of it, we're going to get another level of brightness from that paint mix. So you can see on screen at the moment I'm basically base coating all of the details that aren't red, and I'm doing that with just a black color. Now the reason why I'm doing that, and I say this quite a lot, is because once we have color around the areas that we're painting, even if it's just a black base coat, it gives us a really good idea of what that really looks like. We need the context around the red armor to get a good idea of what that red armor actually looks like. And it is actually an incredibly important thing. So if you get to the stage where you're throwing down your paint, trying to get your highlights in the areas that you like, make sure you just put a base coat of a color on everything else. It will give you a much better idea and understanding of where you're at with this. So with this previous highlight color that we did, the salmon mix, now it's also worth noting you could probably just buy a paint which is salmon color. I just don't have one, so I mixed it. And I mixed it by just adding white and a little bit of that mustard yellow. But it's worth noting with that highlight mix, you can see that I've just placed big blobs of paint on areas that I want to be brighter. But what you'll also notice is those highlight areas are actually very small. The highlight on the top of the shoulder pad, that's a very small sphere. Every area it's very small, and the reason why we're doing only small highlights is not because we want a shiny result or anything like that, but actually the reason being is because we want to keep as much of that saturated Blood Angel style red as possible. We need to keep that red. If our highlights are too large, if our bright areas are too large, what we're going to end up having is a pink marine, which naturally we don't want in the slightest. And it's the same as if our shadow areas are too dark, we're going to end up with a very dark red marine. So we still need to make sure that we have a huge amount of the marine covered in that main red that we've got, and very small highlights pushing towards that salmon tone. Right, so this next bit is actually quite subtle. What we're going to do is we're going back with that red mix, the ink and the P3, like whatever red you're using is absolutely fine. Now the idea with this is we're going over this salmon mix with a transparent paint. So I'm thinning this down more than I did before. This is probably 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part paint. And the idea being is we're going to go over these salmon highlights with a transparent paint. This will give us another layer of highlight, and it will blend those highlight areas together. So that transition that we already have on the model between that salmon color and the red, those should disappear. And you can see I'm painting the same way that I have been painting previously. I'm just doing lots of little marks with the tip of my brush, lots of little scratches, dots, that sort of stuff, just to give us a interesting surface area. And it's also much faster than just glazing over for a really smooth result. So it's a faster process, especially when you're batch painting these models. If you're doing 10, 20, 30 of them, this becomes incredibly quick because you build up a muscle memory quite quickly, and it's not a complicated process once you know how. If you want to know how to do it like in detail, I have got a video, an in-depth video on it on my Patreon, so you can check that out. But you can see it clearly enough from all of the videos that I've done on marines so far, because they've all, other than the Imperial Fist, they've all pretty much been painted the same way. So you can see now that most of the salmon has disappeared, and we've got another tone of red. We've got a brighter red than we had when we put the 2 previous layers over it. So straight away we've got a really striking saturated red with a nice dark shadow. This already looks really nice, and frankly would make for a really nice Blood Angels tabletop army. But at this point I wanted to push it even further because I had more time. So what I did was I added a very small amount of black to my scale 75 deep red, and in certain areas that are pretty much facing the ground, I've placed in some of that really dark black deep red mix, and this is just to kind of push the shadows. The reason why we want to push the shadows is actually because the darker our shadows are, the more vibrant that red will look. Remember, our darks make our lights look brighter and our lights make our darks look brighter. So if you ever want to push your colors without going much brighter, remember to push your shadows and it will lift your colors up. So now we need to highlight this red again, because although it still looks good, it does look really nice at this point. We've got a really nice Blood Angels red. The reality is for me personally, it still looks a little bit flat. And generally the way I feel about miniatures is when I get to a point where I like something, that's the point where I go, right, now I need to push it even further, just because at the very least, even if it ends badly, it means that I've pushed myself and it means that I've learned something new. So if I push these highlights even further with this Blood Angel, one or two things is going to happen. I'm either going to not like it, I'm going to have to fix it, but I'm going to have learned something, or I'm going to get a really nice outcome and it's going to look even better for it. So that's absolutely what I'm going to do. So we're going to go back to that salmon mix. So where we got the scale 75 and the P3 red, and where we added the white and the yellow to give us that nice salmon tone. Now, if you look, the first thing that I'm actually doing here is I'm adding in my edge highlights. Edge highlights are incredibly important for Space Marines. You don't need to edge highlight every single edge, but the ones that are facing upwards, and more importantly, the ones that are prominent. So with Space Marines especially, we want to edge highlight the shapes because it makes the miniature readable. It adds readability to the model. It means from far away we can clearly see the different shapes. So the first thing that I'm doing is adding those edge highlights, because the reality is that's going to make the biggest impact. Now I apologize for my fat head getting in the way. I was using a different camera angle this time, so it shouldn't happen in the future. But you can see already, just by adding this edge highlight with this salmon tone, that it's making a huge difference to this red. And because we don't have a huge amount of it, so because it's only edge highlights and we still have this, we still have the majority of the model with that really saturated red, still looks like a Blood Angel. You can also see that I've added a circle along the top of both shoulder pads, as well as on the sphere on the head, as well as on the knee. These are really prominent features. So if we've built up very slowly with very thin paint, so probably 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part paint, this salmon mix, and I've just created this transition of this brighter color, this brighter mix, to really reinforce the shape of the sphere. These are small details which have a huge impact. Now I'm not going to lie, it's not easy to do. I've done it with lots of little dots and scratches. It's not a simple thing to do, so you can just leave them off, but it does have a massive impact to the result of what you're getting. So I mean, if you're not capable of doing it at this stage, I would definitely recommend that you try, because you're never going to be able to do it unless you give it a go. But the idea is that you're building up lots of little marks with very transparent paint, and then you're getting smaller and smaller, so working towards the center of your highlight area, and that's how you build up the transition. Again, as much as I hate to plug it, there is a more in-depth video on how I do this sort of stuff on my Patreon, so feel free to check it out. But you can see now that the Blood Angel is really coming together, and it's those last highlights with that salmon that really makes it pop. But it still looks like a Blood Angel because we have so much of that red. So next up, what we're going to do is paint the eyes. It was a really obvious choice for me. We were going to do them green because that will stand out the most against the red. This is P3 Necrotite green that I've base coated the eyes in, and then I'm going to add white to that green to make it brighter, and I'm going to paint on inside of both eyes, so the inside of the eyes are brighter. You'll see afterwards what I'll do is on the outside of the eyes, towards the outside of the head, I'm going to add a white dot to either side. I apologize, I didn't add white, I added a yellow. I added ice yellow to the green, not white. So you can see how the inside of the eyes are brighter, so it's pretty much, I'm adding just like tiny little lines to make the inside of the eyes brighter. And then I'll add the white dot to the outside, and then this gives the illusion that it's a lens. Quite a simple way of doing it. You can do more convoluted ways if you want to go to a really high standard, but it's not something that I was really looking for at a decent gaming piece. Again, my head's in the way, I apologize, but you can still see what I'm doing. That's the eyes done. So at this point, I've base coated all of the colors on the model, and I've done the freehand Blood Angel symbol on the shoulder pad because it didn't have any transfers. And then what I've done with all of the details, I've pretty much just put an Agrax Earthshade wash over them. I've said this before, if you've got, with Space Marines, if you've got a really nice armor color, then no one's going to be looking at the details. No one's going to be judging the details. So I base coat all the silver, base coated all the black, and all the small pouches and that sort of stuff. And then I just put an Agrax Earthshade wash over the top of them, and I've left them at that. With the chest eagle, this is really important because it's a prominent feature on the model, so we need to make sure that we do a nice job of it. I've base coated it with, I don't know what it was. It's a dark grey from Games Workshop. I think actually it's dark Reaper grey, but I could be wrong. But I've base coated it with a dark grey, and then what I'm going to do is put a black wash over it, so just Nuln Oil will do. It's also worth noting the base. I've painted the base with a brown, so this was Vallejo Game Color Beastie Brown, and then the GW Averland Earth Crackle paint, I've slapped that over the top. And the difference is, the reason why my cracks are different sizes is because where the cracks are larger, I've put thicker paint down, and then where there are no cracks or very small cracks, there is a thinner amount of paint. So I put that Crackle Earth paint all over the base, and then I've moved it around so there's different areas which are different thicknesses, and that gives me variation. Normally I wouldn't use that stuff as just flat across the base, but figured I'd do something a little bit different with this one, and I didn't have a huge amount of time because the red armor did take me longer than it should have done. So next up with the chest eagle, remember it's a really prominent part of the model. It's a big feature. We need to make sure that we get a nice result on it. So I've got a brighter grey. This one is Vallejo model color pale grey, sorry. I mean, to be fair for you guys, like, it doesn't have to be the same colors, just get a brighter grey. The idea being is I've edge highlighted the top of the wings, the top of the skull, and then to the outside of the feathers on all the feathers, just to define the shapes and make it pop. You don't need to do it. As I said, if the red armor's good, then you don't really need to worry about the rest of the details. In this case, I chose to really push this because it's such a strong prominent feature in the middle of the model, but it's the only real detail that I actually put some work in. The rest of the black on the chainsword and the bolt gun and that sort of stuff, I just pretty much done an edge highlight just to define the shapes on the black, so nothing else really had any time spent on it because, as I said, no one's going to be looking at that stuff. So with the base, I got some grass tufts from Army Painter. These are the swamp tufts, I believe, and I've stuck the swamp tufts on. The idea behind the swamp tufts actually is I've used them to hide the parts of the crackle base that are not interesting. So where I've got large areas of that base where there's not really any cracks because the paint wasn't very thin, or there's a pattern that I don't like, I covered it in a grass tuft. That's it. It's a nice way of adding some interest to a very simple base and hiding parts of it that just aren't particularly nice. And then what you can see, once I've painted the black rim around the base, it sets the model off. All of a sudden it looks finished. The red armor took me a little bit longer than it usually does on this, just purely because I wasn't actually sure how I was going to do it. So normally I'm a bit more prepared, but it's quite a simple process. The armor itself is quite a simple process, although obviously that's not to say that it's easy, but if you can get it down, this marine can be painted in about an hour. And if you're, in about an hour and a half, and if you're batch painting 10, 20 of them, then you could potentially get them down to about an hour each. So that's really good timing for not having an airbrush. So that's the Blood Angel finished. That's the process for it. I'm hoping it's helpful. If you've got any questions, any feedback, as always, leave it in the comments below and I will check it out. I check all the comments and all the support is really much appreciated. So thanks again.